Views and opinions expressed by hosts and guests on Patriots with Grit do not necessarily reflect those of Patriots with Grit LLC, its founders, and owners.
Get ready for truth bombs and guidance from conservative leaders and entrepreneurs from God-fearing, freedom-loving, truth-telling, patriotic Americans. Welcome to Patriots with Grit. Now let's jump into today's episode with your host, Darren Ross.
You probably didn't realize it was happening or even how bad it is, but the government is taking our land, which gives them control over our food, farming, and resources. See how this is happening? Stay tuned. If you don't know by now, major cell phone carriers are monitoring your conversations and your text. They're even terminating service if they don't like what you say. Americans have had enough supporting these companies that hate our values. Are you tired of compromise? It's time to switch to Patriot Mobile, America's only Christian conservative wireless provider.
Patriot Mobile offers dependable nationwide coverage, giving you access to all three major networks, which means you get the same coverage you've been accustomed to without funding the left or the leftist agenda.
When you switch to Patriot Mobile, you support the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the sanctity of life, and our military, veterans, and first responder heroes.
One of the best parts about using Patriot Mobile is they have 100% of their customer service team based right here in the USA, which makes switching absolutely a breeze. You can keep your number, you can keep your phone, or you can even upgrade. Plus, their team will help you find the best plan for your needs. Just go to patriotmobile.com/grit or call 972-PATRIOT. Also, you get free activation when you use the offer code of GRIT. Join us and make the switch today.
So welcome to the show, Margaret Byfield. I'm excited to have you on. We have been waiting on this because we were told that there is a big land grab going on. And, you know, as just citizens, we hear stuff going around, but we never know the severity of it. So fill us in on what is going on.
Yeah, well, the Biden administration, of course, brought our country a lot of problems. One of which was 6 days into his administration, he initiated something called 30 by 30. And the purpose particularly the federal land management agencies and all the conservation programs nationwide, everything from conservation reserve program to, things that used to be thought of as a good thing and now are being thought of as a bad thing for good reasons, because of all the control that comes with that. So really the hard work begins now, which is to entrench this agenda, and not only entrench it inside the federal agencies, but also the environmentalists were very good at getting a lot of money off federal dollars offloaded through grants for conservation projects that have basically just set them up to be well funded for the next 4 years while they wait this out. And so we're going to see their attentions turn to the states, and they'll try to get these agendas in at the state level. And then we're going to see them use those funds to sue the Trump administration to try to stop their efforts to get rid of 30 by 30. So we can celebrate that we've had a great victory this year already with the rescission of 30 by 30, but the hard work now really begins.
So, originally, before, let's just pretend we're in the Biden era still. That was set up. And, I start connecting the dots with Agenda 2030, the control of our land from a food source, natural resources. And The way I understand it, he would protect an area of land, going to protect this area, this natural resources, or throw in a protected species, and then we find out that there's a resource or something in the soil that they want to capitalize on. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yeah, you can trace particularly the big mineral withdrawals that he did. It was all about protecting the minerals, that natural resource. It was not about protecting the species or conserving the land. And my dad said this years and years ago. Our family was involved in the first federal lands grazing takings case ever filed in the United States. And we were in a battle with the federal land management agencies for 13 years on the ground before we filed our case, and the case took 27 years. So we learned a lot in that process. But one of the things that Dad said, which is so true, is that the environmental movement is not about whether we're going to use the resources. It's about who is going to use the resources. So you nailed it. I mean, the purpose of 30 by 30 was never conservation. It was a way to remove the private landowners' control, or in the federal land states, those multiple use rights holders, the people who own the water and the mineral rights and the grazing rights on the federal lands. It was a way to get them removed off so that the ownership of that land, particularly on the private property, could be transferred to somebody else. And that's really what the 30 by 30 agenda is about. It's not about whether we're going to use the resources, it's about who is going to use the resources.
And didn't he have like an angle in there about climate change? Some of this land's being protected, to control climate change.
Yes, I mean, one of the pieces that he was putting in place was a plan amendment for all the National Forest Service plans across the nation that would protect old growth forests. And what they were attempting to do was determine which forests were going to be the old growth forests when X, Y, and Z happens with climate change. I mean, it was just this series of what ifs, and then lock down those areas so that they can be harvested, all based on this what if. And that's what people really need to understand about the climate crisis agenda. It's not based on science. I know they like to say it's based on science. It is not. It is based on projections into the future. Everything with the climate crisis agenda is based on them putting certain facts and I would say subjections or their opinions into a model and extrapolating that out 50 years and saying, oh my gosh, based on this, we're going to lose over 1 million species in the coming generations. That's what the climate crisis is built on. It's built on a projection into the future, which is largely based on people's opinions of what they think is going to happen in the future. And so that's why you cannot rely on any of the climate crisis projections, and you shouldn't be making wholesale changes to a society like Agenda 2030 wants to do based on that. And so it's a house of cards. It's all built on sand. And they really thought they had the momentum to get this in place during the Biden administration. And yes, they did a lot of damage, but I think we're now in a position where the more people that we get to understand what they did can help us dig it out now. Now that we have obviously a conservative administration.
So how far did he get with this? I mean, how much damage did he do? Kind of give me an example.
Yeah, it's hard to know the figures. At the end of the first year, it went from 12% of the land protected to 13% of the land protected. There's one figure in there though that really is not tracked so we can't really see, and that's how many conservation easements have been placed on the private lands. Now, conservation easements, they are something that the environmentalists sell to landowners and say, hey, if you put a conservation easement on your land, it'll never be developed. You'll be able to pass it down to your kids. They won't have to worry about this land ever being developed. It'll always be protected, and in agriculture, whatever you're doing today, you can continue to do. And so they sell the landowner this dream. But what happens when a landowner signs a conservation easement with the land trust or the government is it creates a conservation purpose, and the land trust determines and controls the execution of that conservation purpose. So all the uses of the land are frozen at the time that the contract is signed. And when you read a conservation easement, you will see that there's all these restrictions on the landowners. The only people that are restricted in a conservation easement are the landowners themselves. They are told, you can never build more than X number of homes on this piece of land forever. These contracts are signed in perpetuity. So the landowner today has to decide, okay, maybe my kids might come back and want to build a house. They have to write that in that contract today. Well, what happens in 2 generations when more kids want to come back and build a house, right? You can't do it. So all the restrictions are on the landowner in a conservation easement. The control of that property and the development right, which is usually the most valuable part of that property, is now owned by the land trust or the government. And so, people get into these contracts and they say, well, this will mean that our land will never be condemned, it'll never be developed. Well, that's not true. Any piece of property in America can be condemned. The conservation easement doesn't protect that. They say, well, we can always continue to stay in farming and ranching. Well, you can at the activity level you're doing today, but what happens when technology changes and things become more efficient? You can't deploy those on your land. So now, if these were signed back in settlement days, like in the early 1900s, then we would still have parcels that could only use horse and buggy to plow the land. That's essentially what it means. So these conservation easements have been sold to landowners as a way to protect the land, but what the landowners do when they sell that contract to the land trust is they actually sell the control of that property. And that means the land is no longer private property. And it's the IRS who defends it, the IRS who protects that right. So
well,
we have...
clarify something for me, because I'm having a little bit of trouble. So it's different than me just going out in the county here and buying a piece of land, because federal-owned land can be, sold, or leased to somebody to build houses on? How does that... I'm not following that.
No, not the federal-owned land. So with conservation easements are put on a private land, but the easement itself can be owned either by a land trust or the government. So federal, state, or local can own that easement. So whoever owns the conservation easement now actually has primary control of that land. That's why we tell people it's their right to put a conservation easement on the land. They just need to understand that once they do, it's no longer private property, because control is the most fundamental element of private property, and that has just been sold to the holder of that easement. So it's no longer private property. So getting back to what we were talking about, your question, how far did they go in this agenda? And I said it's hard to put a number on it, because you have all of these land trusts across the country that the federal government has been pouring money into to place conservation easements on landowners' land. And the number, I think, would be very frightening if we knew how many acres in America now have conservation easements as a result. And I just say that because I get a news feed every day which picks up all the stories of conservation easements being put in place. And every day I will read 4 or 5 stories that'll come up where it's a new story where 150 acres here, 20,000 acres here have been placed in this nice conservation easement to be protected forever. And, you see that daily, and this number is getting very big. So that's a huge problem.
Okay, so when you're in this easement, can they tell you what you can and cannot grow on that property? You can't till it. You can't, plow it up. Can they dictate that?
Depends on the terms of the easement. So basically, they write a baseline report, which means all the activity occurring on that land today can continue to occur. Okay, so if you have an area that's in crop, you can do that. But depending on how restrictive that language is, you may not be able to change the type of crop. So anybody who signs the easement has to make sure anything they plan to do in the future is specifically written into that contract. We know one family, it was the father that signed the easement. Now it's the children running the property, and they simply wanted to change the breed of goats, which were the kids' show goats, right? They weren't even, it wasn't their main business, but they wanted to change the breed of goats. The Nature Conservancy came out and said, oh, you can't do that. That violates the terms of your conservation easement. You've got to keep the same type of goats. So it depends. It can be really restrictive. But the problem is, how is any landowner going to be able to write into the future exactly what they want to do 20 years from now? I mean, most landowners will tell you that they can put together a plan for their property, how they want to manage it, where they want to see it grow, that they can do a 5-year plan. It'll never come about that way because nature always changes. And so it's a good roadmap, but they know that they need to be flexible because that's going to change significantly before they get to the end of the 5 years. So to think that you're going to write that kind of plan that's going to last forever and keep that landowner in business is very naive.
So, I mean, none of this surprises me because everything's about control. And I was really intrigued. I saw where you were telling a story about your dad, your property, and a fence and the staple.
Oh, you heard that story.
On that?
Well, so that goes back to our time on the ranch. So our ranch was in Nevada. Nevada is 87% government owned. So, but 83% is federally owned. So you literally cannot have a cow-calf operation in Nevada without having significant use of the federal lands because they own it all. And, you know, anybody who's been through Nevada knows it's not exactly the nice, lush, swampy ground that you see in the east, right? It's very open, very arid. It is perfect for cattle grazing. I mean, it's a great place to raise a cow because a cow can, you know, travel a long distance without having to have water, and it's open and you just don't have disease. I mean, it's perfect. The forage is great for a cow. But in our place, so our ranch was a typical Nevada ranch, typical size, and it covered 1,100 square miles. So 80 miles from end to end. But out of that, only 7,000 acres of that were private deeded land. Then we owned the water and had the grazing rights on the lands surrounding those 7,000 acres that our predecessors were first in right and, of course, own that right. So, but in that process, you have the Forest Service and the BLM issue you a grazing permit, and which is a recognition of your right. You wouldn't get it if you didn't have that right. So they give you a grazing permit, and it has terms and conditions that you have to meet. And so if they find you have violated one of those, then typically they give you 10 days to cure it, or else they will penalize you, like cancel your grazing permit or reduce the number that you can be on it. So getting back to the story, in our very first year on the ranch, our very first grazing season, it was a 105-day grazing season with the Forest Service. We received 40 certified letters claiming we were violating the terms of our and conditions of our grazing permit, and 70 visits from the Forest Service. And it was all designed to drive us out of business because they had filed an application over all of our water rights. If we went away, they would assume those water rights without having to pay for them. Okay?
Well, let me ask you, so were you violating the contract, or were they just developing things?
So that gets back to the staple, right? So one of these issues in those 40 certified letters, just one of those violations, they said we were not maintaining our drift fences on the top of Table Mountain. So our ranch house sits at 7,000 foot elevation. Table Mountain's about 12,000 foot elevation. It is a day to ride up, a day to ride about 25 miles of fence to find the problem, and a day to come back down. And because it's wilderness, you know, you can't cut a tree down up there you have to pack everything in, and you can't use anything that is not mechanical. Everything has to be mechanical. So Dad sent, one of our employees up with a pack horse full of all the fencing equipment to figure out what's the big problem, right? So after 3 days, he comes back down and he throws a yellow plastic flag on the dining room table. And Dad said, well, so what was the problem? What was the violation? He said, well, out of 25 miles of fence, there was one staple missing. One staple in a fence. That was our violation.
Were these compliance people? Were they walking that fence? Were they checking it all out, or did they just make this up?
Well, they had the blue flag. They had marked it.
So they'd been up there.
So they went up there, and they marked it. But my question always was, how did that one staple get out? I mean, really,
point.
If they went to that much trouble and they walked a fence and they didn't find any problems, how did that one staple get out? Right?
Yes.
So anyway, it raises a lot of questions. But at the end of the day, that doesn't even make common sense to harass a landowner over one staple that's not going to make or break the security of that fence. Right? On the top of a very remote mountain in the middle of central Nevada that few people even know about. There's cows, there's elk, there's Forest Service people, and there's ranchers up there. And in hunting season, there's hunters. But I mean, this is a really remote area. So, it was harassment. And it's the power of the federal government. They know that they have the bureaucracy, that they can run people like my family out of business. And we literally have no way to fight back and expose that. One thing that I think surprises people about our story is that all of that stuff happened primarily during the Reagan and Bush years, when we had really good people in Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture overseeing these agencies. And the reason I bring that up is to remind people how difficult it is to get policies of the Trump, like what we're seeing the Trump administration do right now, which is phenomenal, which we love, to see these policies actually trickle down to the bottom line where they get implemented and where people either are harmed or helped by the federal government. It's very difficult for those policies to reach the actual place where they're implemented, as in our case.
So there is a lot to this. There was the landmark case. I don't know if it's Hague or Hagee versus United States. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, that's our case, Hage versus
that's
United
it? Okay.
States. So that's our family's case. And so, we bought the ranch in 1978. That very first year, we had those, 70 violations, right? We had that stuff going on for 13 years. I mean, that level of harassment for 13 years. We filed 3 administrative appeals cases, won them all, and they would just come back and do the same thing to us the next year. So in 1991, my parents finally said, okay, look, we're not getting anywhere with this approach. So that's when they decided to take a different approach and put together and filed the very first federal lands grazing case ever filed against the federal land management agencies in America. That case was filed in 1991. We actually won every round. The U.S. Court of Federal Claims awarded our family $14.4 million for the taking of our property, which was incredible. And it was just an incredible moment. Wow. However, the Forest Service appealed, and that went to the D.C. Circuit on appeal. Now, the D.C. Circuit at the time was primarily Eastern-based judges. And if you know anything about the federal lands issues, they are extremely complex. And it's very hard for people who come from a private land background to understand those complexities. So I think a lot of what happened was, for those judges, it was easier to accept the Forest Service's arguments and just basically defer to the federal agency than to actually get into the messier side of who owned what in the West, which was the question we were trying to get to actually resolve the problem. So at the end of the day, they punted, and they rejected our case overturned our case based on two technicalities, saying we didn't have standing or ripeness, after being in court for 27 years. But,
Yeah, right. It would be rotted by then.
yeah. So we were never compensated. Obviously, we lost the Takens case, which would have been an incredible precedent that would have helped Westerners immensely if that could have stood. So we lost the case. We were never compensated, and ultimately we ended up losing the ranch.
The miracle to me is hope in a glass. When you create nitric oxide, you are igniting the spark of life in the cell. It is the miracle molecule. That's why we called this cardio miracle, because of nitric oxide and what it can do for the whole body.
So is this primarily a problem out west, or is it in other places around the country that are kind of targets for taking that land?
I would say the West is a low-hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, is so dominant. It's dominated by the federal lands issues. So there's so much federal power out there. 50% of the West is owned by the federal government. So, so they're low-hanging fruit. It's easy to isolate. It's easy to persecute because there's not enough people out there who could really stand up and fight this. But what 30 by 30 was doing was trying to make the rest of the nation look like the West, where that kind of power could also be wielded over the private landowners in the East. So, and they're still intent on that agenda. I mean, that agenda's not gone.
So I'm in Missouri. So if there was something there that they've identified that they needed lithium, they could come in and just say, come up with one of these fabricated reasons and come in and just say, we're going to buy all this acreage, even though you already own it.
Well,
I'm
actual
not sure
condemnation.
How that works.
Yeah, actual condemnation is actually harder to do than just regulating you out of business.
Oh.
So the path that would be easier in that case was say, hey, we think there's an endangered species on your property.
Of course.
And then, if they can go through the process and what did the Biden administration do? They listed the monarch butterfly. It's one of their last species that they listed before they left office. Well, the monarch butterfly is everywhere. So it's on everybody's property. And, we don't, hopefully, the Trump administration is going to be reasonable and get that all taken back. But it'll still be a long bureaucratic process. But they can use things like the Endangered Species Act, the Wetlands Act, or the Clean Water Act, and say, hey, you've got a wetlands on your property. I mean, under the Obama administration, they had defined what a wetlands was so that a mud hole could be a wetlands, that only has a little water in it for a little bit of time. So that's the problem. That's the danger with these federal agencies having so much power and no accountability, is that there's a million different ways they can use the environmental regulations to target your land, run you off the land if there's something there that they want to own.
Yeah, so how much was the EPA involved in all this?
Well, the EPA, the Trump administration had actually rewritten those wetland regulations because Obama's administration was sued, and the court said, you've gone too far, you can't regulate land like this. And so the courts actually, the states are the ones that brought the suit, and the courts actually backed up the Obama administration. So the Trump administration wrote new regulations which complied with the court's interpretation. So under the Trump years, Trump regulations, they didn't have that kind of power. It really limited what they could do on private property under the Clean Water Act. Well, when Biden got in, he rescinded all that and wrote new regulations which were closer to what Biden was trying to do. And of course, so there was a whole nother lawsuit that went forward. So now the new EPA under the Trump administration is going to have to work through all of that again and figure out how to get things sized up so that they are appropriate to what Congress had intended with the Clean Water Act on how that act is supposed to be implemented. So it's going to be a big job. But that's one of the big tools that EPA had. However, there's another place where it did not get as much notice as I think it should have gotten, and that's that the Biden EPA set out some affluent rules that applied to meat processing plants, where there's certain things that could not go into the water, and they changed definitions, they changed levels of things that could go in the water, and the end of the day, what it meant is that meat processors were going to have to invest in water filtration systems that were one estimate I heard was going to be about $500,000 to put in, and then another $100,000 to maintain every year. Well, essentially, what that does is it gets rid of all your small meat processors. They can't afford that. So it's only the big guys, the big giants, that are going to be able to stay in business under that. And so the local foods movement, people who like to go down to the farmer's market and buy their beef, or like myself, I buy directly from the rancher and stock it in my freezer. I'll buy a portion of a cow. That pushes all of those meat processors out of business, because your small local landowner is processing to the closest meat processor. And if those all go away because of these regulations, because the small meat processor can't stay in business, then we are really harming the local foods movement. So, there's things like that do connect back into property rights that were going on. And, if they can take the land and control the land, they control our food supply. So it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like you take the land and you get all of the residual things that come with it. You can control the food, you can get the resources, you can control the people.
Yeah.
And I heard you say one time that, our founding fathers wanted us to have land, because if the people have the land, the government can't control it.
Exactly.
Well, okay, so you have that. And I wanted to ask you, how does the Fourth Amendment factor in here? Because, and maybe it's not applicable, but the Fourth Amendment talks about having a sovereign person having their land, and they can do with that land whatever they want as long as it does not infringe on others.
Right.
But we don't have that freedom.
It absolutely does apply, and you're exactly right. What the founders were trying to do was create a country that did not look like the European nations. Right? That's what they were leaving. The fundamental thing that secured that was that the people would own the property. The people would own the land and the natural resources. So the idea was that if the people were truly going to control their government, we the people were going to control the government, then the government had to come to the people for their funding and their power. And if the government owns the natural resources, they can self-fund, and they can wield a lot of power against the American people. So, the first, like the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase made by Jefferson, every acre of that was disposed of to the citizens. So you could go out and stake anywhere from 120 to 640 acres. Missouri, I think, was founded that way. And so, the idea was every piece of land in America would be owned by the people. If the people owned the land, the people could control their government. So now, and that was a philosophy that worked until we got to the 13 Western states, and the environmental movement was getting headway, and the progressive movement was getting headway, and so they were successful in lobbying Congress to start withholding the land and retaining ownership of the land as the Western states came into statehood. So that's why 50% of the West. So that's why 50% of the West is basically federalized, because that's when the philosophy changed in America. But we're at a dangerous tipping point, because as much as I love so many of the things that Trump is doing, when he talks about buying Greenland, the first thing that goes through my head is who's going to own that, the federal government or the people? Because it matters.
I never thought about
the
that.
Answer to that the answer to that question matters. So one of the things that I think would be very, very helpful that Congress could do right now, and this is something that your listeners could certainly weigh in on. Representative Harriet Hagman has filed a bill, the no net gain of federal lands in America. which means the federal government can't acquire any more lands until it disposes of other lands. That is the key bill that would keep us in a position. Let's say we do acquire Greenland. Well, then there has to be a sell-off of other lands so that the people maintain the power over the government. And I'll just sum it up this way. Right now, I think conservatives are just elated with what Trump is doing, and I am one of them. I mean, every day, I wake up and I want to cheer some more because he is.
I don't know.
Completely...
As we say here a lot, we're kind of tired of the winning.
Oh, no, we're not tired of that.
No, we're not tired.
But I think, what we're doing is we're taking care of the short-term things that have to be taken care of right now. Secure the border, get rid of DEI, get education back into the hands of the people instead of the federal government. I mean, there's so many things that he's doing right now that are absolutely essential. Get control of the spending, my gosh. It's incredible what he's doing. But those are short-term fixes, unless at the same time we secure to the people the power to maintain control over the federal government. And so that's where, when we start talking about acquiring other lands in other countries, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, but are we looking long-term? Are we building a federal government, or are we securing the nation that our founders created and gave us?
Well,
it's a big question.
Yeah, so we've established that it's beyond constitutional. And the other thing that I think people need to consider, I'm not a lawyer, but I've kind of learned in the last 4 years, all of these rulemaking is not a law. It is like OSHA. They make a rule, and then they come out and fine you, but it's not law. And a lot of times, it's not a constitutional rule. So that's the way I understand it.
Yeah, so the law is what Congress passes. The regulations are what the agencies write to implement that law. And unfortunately, Congress has delegated that authority to the agencies. But it is important to understand that when you're talking about the statute and the regulations, they are different. What is the law is what Congress passes,
right?
Not what the agencies have written, and that is a distinction. It doesn't mean that the regulations don't apply, but it's a very significant distinction, and you need to understand which one of those you're fighting and how to fight them.
Well, and that's the other thing is if you try to fight them, they've got the big checkbook. They're going to lawfare you until you can't go anymore. So there we have our government working against the people instead of it flipped around.
Right.
So,
yeah, that's one of those things that has to be corrected, and I'm hoping this administration will really work on that. So.
Yeah, they're cleaning some stuff out, that's for sure.
They are.
They're getting rid of a lot of waste. So over at your organization, American Stewards of Liberty, that's americanstewardsofliberty.us. Tell us about the organization and how you guys are attacking this.
Yeah, so we are a property rights organization. We really focus on helping Americans retain the right to use their land, to grow our food, energy, minerals, all of that. So all of these property rights issues are what we focus on. We spend a lot of time focusing on what Washington, D.C. is doing and educating the members on these issues. And then we also watch what's going on in the states. So we have a weekly publication, online publication called Liberty Matters. And it's really, I think, a good tool to, we kind of recap what is happening in Congress that week and key bills that I think are good for people to know are being filed. Just other key things. It's kind of a short synopsis of what's going on the property rights front. I highly recommend, if people are interested in these issues, to subscribe to that. That'll get you kind of plugged into this whole issue and keep you apprised of what's going on. And what we do to fight it, I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, and a lot of what we do is meet with our elected officials and educate them on these issues. And we work with state representatives as well, and we work with a lot of local governments too, because that's key, is restoring local control. That's where all of these policies are implemented. So our county commissioners are really important too. We work at all levels.
So you mentioned Harriet Hageman. We've had her on twice. The first time she talked about the RFID tagging of the cattle, and how that's kind of a sham too, because the smaller farmers can't afford all the stuff, and it basically gives the government once again a way to cull herds and control meat. And then it surfaced the Interstate Meat Act, I think it's called, and it has to do with small packing plants and USDA inspections. It's just they just keep clamping down to the point that we're not going to be able to even afford our food if it's there. And so all of this we've said, that, we've talked about Agenda 2030, and I think about the government taking our land, and then our government giving it or selling it to China, and then you got Bill Gates, that's probably the biggest private landowner in the country. I mean, where's it going?
We're seeing the consolidation. We're seeing the consolidation. And that, again, it gets back to what our founders were trying to protect all of us from, was monopolies and consolidations. That's why the land was to be owned by the citizens in small parcels. Small family farms was the model for America, so that the land was distributed among the people. And this consolidation and these monopolies is exactly what our founders were trying to prevent. So we have to be really vigilant and fight these on every front. And now that we have an administration that obviously is going to, I think, agree with us on these issues, it's even more important that we continue to raise these issues and make sure they are top line issues for this administration to get on top of. One of the things I think that's important for your landowners and anybody listening to this podcast is, there's this sense that you have to have a lot of money, and there's the elite class, and they're the only ones who get anything done. I disagree. Our philosophy on policy making is that if it helps the small landowner, it's going to help the big landowner. But the policies that help the corporate landowner or the big landowner are not always going to help the small landowner. In fact, they're probably going to hurt them. Mm-hmm. So our small landowners are such an important voice that Congress needs to hear, and state representatives need to hear from. And so I just encourage everybody, get in the fight. Get in the fight, stay in the fight, advocate for what we need. Thomas Jefferson said it best. He said the small landholder was the most important part of the state. And what he meant by that was that it's the small landowner that is most vital and critical to protecting liberty in this new country that they were founding. Right. And I love that. I love how he said that. And we have to remember how important our landowners are.
One of my last questions here is, do you have any intel that there are any areas like in the Midwest they're targeting?
Well, I think any place that you can see a major natural resource reserve, it's a target. Okay. So, yeah.
And I honestly don't know what that is around here. I know Kansas has a salt vein, but that's about it. I don't know if they want salt or not, but so yeah.
A lot of times it's water.
Well, and it could be, it could be. So, well, I truly appreciate you coming on. I know this is a problem that probably most people don't know the gravity of. And see, when you're in this like we are, you start seeing the things that are eroding our republic. And we got to stop some of this erosion. So I didn't mean that as a pun for land, by the way, but yeah. So Margaret, I really appreciate it. And, people need to get to your website, look at it. And I don't know if you've got any big events coming up that, I guess I should ask you that. Do you have anything coming up?
Well, we'll be doing a summit this year, but we haven't solidified the date. Okay. So just keep a watch out on our website.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. See you. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Patriots with Grit. You can find us on other platforms to include Rumble, X, Telegram, Facebook. We're back on YouTube. But let's just see how long that lasts. They say they're not censoring anymore. We'd like for you guys to go over and take a look at our Patriots with Grit Patriots Partners store on patriotswithgrit.com. Spit it out, Randy. We have a lot of products and services in there that I think that you guys will be interested in. And anytime you purchase, you help those Patriots and you help us keep our show up. So be sure to like, subscribe, and most of all, share this so we get the word out. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.